Crimson Sun. Book 1 of The Eyes of Fate. Written by Colby Dunn. To my wife Lola, who powers everything I do. None can say the will of fate. He sits on thrones of gold and waits upon the destinies of men, upon the paths that they will take, until he greets them at the gates. None can know his endless scheme. Light and dark the blades he crafted channel the flow of the rapids of time. Nations clash with greed and hate, until he greets them at the gates. Dweller of the crushed isles. Author unknown.
Chapter 1. Grimhall. Caleb Rembrandt sat forward, staring into the consuming darkness. Hunching away from the cold stone walls, he grasped the hilt of his sword, leaning against it for support. The air had grown thick and dank, as he and his men had made their way through the passage under the keep. Now they waited in position. From somewhere further in, slow dripping water echoed rhythmically in Caleb's ears, as if the very foundations of Grimhall's keep were weeping their last tears before the cruel reality of defeat overcame them. And cruel it was. Grimhall's treason had sealed an inevitable doom, and the great deity Fate had turned his face from them once and for all. Caleb could not help it. The darkness of the passageway cast a damp shadow on the feelings he vainly attempted to suppress. "Where are my scouts?" he thought to himself. With each passing minute he envisioned the horrible scene ensuing outside, the green plains of Celosia stained red with the blood of men who just weeks ago were deemed allies of Tritus. The blood of alleged traitors and his own countrymen. And for what? Caleb's mind raced. There had to be a mistake. He knew King Rawlin, and knew that he was not the man to betray them. He would not have started this conflict. Not him. In his brooding, Caleb could nearly hear the echoes of war reverberating through the layers of stone and earth, but there was only silence. Where are the scouts? He promptly shook off his worries and straightened his back, ready to move at the signal. Through the thick darkness he sensed the faint rustling of the 30 men crouched 10 spans ahead, and he pictured his friend Anselm sitting directly in front of him against the opposite wall, his warden robes trailing away from him onto the wet rock. "Don't give in to sleep, my friend," Caleb whispered into the dark. He heard his friend stir with a soft chuckle. "Sleep," Anselm responded. "I think not. I'm simply saving my strength should the need of a hex arise. Let us pray it will not. There's no telling what we may encounter up there." Caleb gazed in the direction of the hatch above them, though he couldn't see it. "I would suspect the scouts should be coming back soon. Or else a slew of Grimhall troopers come to burn us out of this rabbit hole," Anselm said in a tone that was all too serious. Caleb imagined the scene and abruptly dismissed it. "That won't happen. It can't happen. If we all die here, this war will go on and could even spread back home to Tritus. If I can just get to King Rawlin, this can all be averted. He will listen to me. I'm sure of it." "Leave those concerns to me, Ansel," Caleb reassured him. "There will be no men of Grimhall marching down here. Not a soul is being spared from the battle on the fields before the keep. The plan will work," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Suddenly a strange echo from deep within the passageway they had traveled pierced the sharp silence. He heard his men shift in the dark as their hands tightened on the hilts of their swords, but Caleb didn't move. He knew the sound. The passage was still for a few short moments until the expected sign from the scouts emerged. A small ball of light, perhaps 100 spans off, pulsed once and died back down to nothingness. "Anselm," Caleb said. "It is time." Anselm responded without a word as a soft white hue started to faintly sprout, and as the darkness fled from around it, Caleb saw Anselm's features illuminate before him. Stark shadows danced across his face and against the rugged stones of the wall behind him. He was holding his hands out in the proper hex formation, and Caleb could see the light pouring from the scars in his palms. Anselm squinted down the tunnel where the sign had appeared. For a moment, while the tunnel was visible, Caleb shot a reassuring nod to the armored men all waiting in a huddle. Some had drawn their swords already, while others tightened their gloves or adjusted their helmets. They responded with quick nods of their own. Caleb could see the handful of wardens in the back of the group wearing robes similar to Anselm's, rubbing their palms as well. Anselm's light vanished in an instant and then was rekindled for the second time, finishing the signal and remaining lit. "That's it then," he said almost to himself. "Grimhall is as empty as it's going to be." Caleb stood, placed his horned helmet on his head and fastened his sword to his side. "Right," he said to the others who had scrambled to their feet. "We make for King Roland's chambers as swiftly as possible. Captain Anselm and I will lead. Avoid engaging the enemy at all cost." Caleb had to swallow a lump in his throat when he heard himself refer to the Solosians as enemies. But there was no going back now. If we are forced against any foes, do all you can to spare them and strike only in defense. Wardens, this will largely be up to you. If they get close enough, we will be forced to cut them down. The wardens at the back nodded firmly. "We are here to end the Grimhall crisis before it spreads over into our lands. We are here for the peace of Solosia and Avondale." Questions? Silence surrounded the men as if they too shared his grief. "Fate be with us." He tapped his forehead twice and cupped his mouth in reverence, and they all did the same. "Move out." Anselm moved to the wall next to Caleb and held his hands above his head, illuminating the hatch in the stone above them. They hoisted Caleb high and carefully he pressed against it, until the rock jumped out of place with a loud grate. He slid the chunk of rock aside and peered into the room above. He felt a surge of relief as he saw exactly what he expected, a small but empty room lined with dusty wood boxes, grain crates and shelves of perished foodstuffs. The place had been long since abandoned, and he noticed there were no candles in the sconces on the walls. Their information had been correct. Nodding below that the way was clear, he scrambled into the room and one by one helped the men up as quickly and silently as possible. By the time Anselm broke his hex formation to climb up, the wardens in the room had replaced his light with theirs. Without speaking a word, they replaced the stone slab and filed out the door. The group worked their way up a winding staircase and down some halls, before the light from their hexes gave way to the soft burning glow of lit torches from the room ahead. They crept along like shadows into the light to find a disheveled dining hall. The tables and chairs were pushed aside carelessly, some overturned with uneaten food strewn about. A lone cat sat on the back of a chair and watched them, its tail swishing back and forth accusingly as if it were a spy for Grimhall lacking the power to hinder them. They had no idea we were coming, Caleb thought. The feline watched them as they cautiously made their way through the maze of clutter and through the large doors at the opposite end of the room. They found themselves in a wide hallway cut from the same crude stone as the old keep, although it was garnished with thin red carpet that trailed down the center and up the stairs beyond. Caleb drew his sword, and Anselm prepared for any hexes he would have to cast, keeping his hands out in front of him at the ready. They had only gone 30 paces down the hallway when the sounds of dozens of falling metal feet echoed from the level above them, accompanied by vague shouts and grunts. Almost as if the group shared one mind, they darted down a branching hallway and extinguished as many torches as they could, veiling themselves in shadow. Sure enough, they could hardly catch their breath before a group of 45 soldiers of Grimhall came storming down the stairs past them in a stampede of urgency. Caleb and Anselm watched from the dark as the wave rushed by. "Hurry! They are pressing their way to the gates," yelled the one at the forefront who seemed in charge of the little brigade. "Move! Draw your weapons. This is the last stand of Grimhall." Caleb shut his eyes tightly as he heard the words. The commander continued spouting orders along with a few other words to instill bravery in their hearts as they ran down the hallway and bent out of sight. When the sound of their footfalls had faded again to a low rumble, the group of men emerged from hiding. "Did you hear that? The day is ours," Anselm said with an empty grin. Caleb nodded. "Our time is shorter than I thought. Come. We have no time to waste." The group of men glided up the stairs as their eyes darted from side to side, keeping aware of their surroundings. The sewage passage they had taken under the castle had disoriented him more than he thought it would. It had been 3 years since Caleb had been to Grimhall with his own King Hallis, at the time he was first made captain, and if it had not been for the maps they had studied in the war councils back in Tritus, he would have truly been lost. As they finished climbing the stairs to the second level, they stood face to face with a 10-foot statue of ancient Grimhall himself, and suddenly Caleb's confidence in their path returned. The king's chambers were near. Caleb led them on, but as he rounded a corner, he froze. Caleb found himself looking into the eyes of an armed trooper, with a huddle of others close behind him. The leader jumped back, and they all drew their weapons. "Tritus scum. How did you get in here?" "Hold. We are not here to kill," Caleb said. "Lay down your arms and you will be spared." The soldier in front turned his head to one of his subordinates, without taking his eyes from Caleb and Anselm. "Run. Warn the king," he ordered. The soldier obeyed and turned to flee. "Don't let him escape," Caleb exclaimed. A wide grin crossed Anselm's face, and all at once every armed man sprang into action. The enemies rushed forward as Caleb's men charged to meet them. Anselm dodged off to one side, while his hands contorted together into a tangle of fingers, making the formation of a first-degree hex that would halt the fleeing man's escape. The foremost soldier charged Anselm, attempting to stop his hex, but his blade met Caleb's in a flash of sparks. With a quick deflection to the side and a heavy kick to the chest, Caleb sent the man to the ground and into the rock wall. His head collided with the stone, and he rolled to his side unconscious. Caleb turned to see Anselm pursuing the messenger, who was nearly out of sight, and darted after them, leaving his men to finish with the others. Caleb clenched his teeth in frustration at shedding blood after all. He spat away the sour taste in his mouth, and he hoped that this was the only time they would veer from their intentions. He caught up to Anselm as they entered a large empty courtroom with a 50-span ceiling and narrow squared pillars lining the length of the walls. A set of heavy doors with a large coiling serpent, the crest of Grimhall painted on the face of it, stood at the end of the chamber. Beyond was the throne room. He entered the court just in time to see the runner turn and Anselm unleash his hex upon him. A gust flew forward, and the man froze as it went over him, as though his body were suddenly bound by a heavy rope. He fell flat on his face and struggled to move his limbs in vain. Keeping his hands in formation, Anselm yanked them quickly to his side, sliding his captive across the floor and out of the way, even as Caleb's men and the other wardens came rushing into the room to detain him. "Ready yourself," Caleb said to his companion. "Whatever lies behind those doors will secure our future or seal our doom." "Very encouraging, Captain," Anselm mumbled. They pushed the doors open and jumped inside, ready to meet the last horde of soldiers defending the king. Anselm had already started preparing a hex, but his hands dropped to his sides at the emptiness that greeted them. The room was dark and completely vacant, the throne sitting abandoned against the backdrop of a large stained glass window. The silence was thick, the air cold, and Caleb's heart reached out to grasp a feeling that was not there. Relief. Disappointment. "I don't understand," Anselm muttered in frustration. "Where is he?" He turned a few times in confusion. "He's not here." Caleb ventured in a bit further and shook his head, confused. "But we made sure," he said mostly to himself. "He has to be here. Wasn't the soldier coming just now to warn him?" Escaped. "He could be halfway to Talgarth by now," Anselm said, imagining the worst scenario possible. "He's betrayed us for those savages, and now he deserts his people and flees to the queen like a gruel to his cave." Caleb paced and looked down the passageway they had traveled, expecting to see enemies piling in to trap them, but only his men stood watching from a distance. Caleb placed his hand against his helmet. "We secured all of the main gates and the waterfront. There is no other way out of Grimhall. He must be in the keep somewhere, but it would take days to search it completely." "Perhaps he has taken his own life out of shame," Anselm suggested with a snarl. "Or it could be a trap. Anyway, he isn't here, so we had better get moving before the battle is won." He signaled for his wardens and they nodded, turning to leave. Reluctantly, Caleb signaled for half of his men to follow and ordered a few others to return back down the tunnel and inform Commander Arvis. Anselm paced and opened his mouth to speak, but stopped when he noticed Caleb still as stone, squinting and listening to the silence. "What is it?" Anselm whispered, checking around him again with a suspicious eye. Caleb raised his free hand. Wait. Slowly scanning the walls, Caleb made his way around the edges of the throne room, looking up and down the long banners hung on the wall, adorned with the serpent crest of Grimhall, until he came to the plinth where the throne sat lonely and desolate. Caleb could feel Anselm watching intently as he cautiously climbed the stairs and stopped before the great chair. He stared at it a moment, then sheathed his sword and, gripping the arms of the throne with both hands, heaved it aside. It toppled over the landing and cracked onto the stone floor below. There before him cowered King Roland II of Grimhall. The aging man had been curled up into a ball with both of his old hands covering his head, but as soon as his cover was torn away, he lashed out like an animal released from its rope, and with a shrill cry delved for Caleb's throat with bony hands. "Fate thrust you down to the pits," he roared. Caleb jumped back in surprise and brandished his sword in defense, but King Roland stopped short, blinking with wide eyes. He was the man Caleb remembered, but instead of noble and wise, he looked weak and utterly pitiful, like a child lost in the rain. The wrinkles on his face seemed much deeper than he remembered, and his eyes were wide with terror as they searched his face. His thick black robe was lined with a cusp of fur, yet it somehow looked cold. Caleb needed the moment just as much to take in what he could not believe was King Roland. Young Rembrandt? Caleb, son of Damon. A surge of relief came over Caleb, as hope of stopping the war appeared on the horizon. I knew he would talk. I knew it. He stepped back a few paces just in case and sheathed his weapon. Indeed it is I, your highness. You remember well, though it has been more than 3 years since King Hallis brought me here. I am honored. Anselm crossed the room to the base of the stairs leading to the throne's platform. Caleb turned to him and gave him a small, reassuring smile. Relief spread across Anselm's face, and his small huddle of men outside the chambers eased back. King Roland wore a hint of a grin, although it didn't feel right somehow. He was staring through Caleb absently as if he were not even there. An odd uncertainty sparked in Caleb, but before he could do anything else, Roland placed a hand on his shoulder. Yes. Yes. I could not forget the son of Damon Rembrandt visiting my halls, he said joyfully as he walked him down the stairs where Anselm stood. You were a new captain then, if I recall. Your first trip to Salosia and to Grimhall. He left Caleb at the stairs and walked on a little further. He spoke with his hands behind his back, and his eyes to the ceiling as if he were recalling his most blissful memory. We must prepare a feast for your return. Yes. A feast. Guards, he called to the empty room. Guards. Come at once. Caleb's men outside the doors exchanged concerned glances. Caleb found the same confusion in Anselm's eyes. The odd feeling grew in Caleb's mind, although he still could not place what it was. There is no one here, King, Caleb said firmly, determined to accomplish his mission. When I came, those years ago, I witnessed the renewal of a bond of trust between our nations. A treaty of fealty against the rising in the Estalons, and Tritus has come to believe that you have broken that treaty. King Roland stood frozen with his hands still locked behind his back. He turned his head and gave them a sidelong stare. Treaty. Caleb could not distinguish if it was confusion or contempt in his voice. You have sent armed forces to the Estalons to join with the ranks of Talgarth, our enemies, Caleb continued. And when we sent for an explanation, you returned our ambassador back to us in a basket. Your Highness, as we speak, the blood of your people and ours is being spilt. Tell us what is going on, and we can end this conflict. We have come to put an end to all of this madness. The old king's shoulders moved up and down, as a slight chuckle built and rolled into a hysterical cackle. Caleb's heart sank. Anselm spoke up for the first time, undeterred by Caleb's bafflement. King Roland, time is short. The keep is won for Tritus. Call your men back before all of them have fallen. The laughter stopped almost instantly, and Roland turned to face them as if he had never noticed Anselm was in the room. A mighty warden has also come, he said, nodding in approval and motioning to the robes Anselm wore. Anselm gave a half-hearted nod. Caleb could see he was growing impatient with the king's antics. He opened his mouth to speak again, but King Roland cut him short. You obey orders and thrust your sword at those whom your king wills, but you understand nothing. As he spoke, his words started to slow and his eyes drifted upward in a daze. His face had turned slightly pale, and his hands were trembling. The lioness has more than just her legions of Talgarth at her side. Her powers cannot be repelled by any force on earth, cannot even be comprehended by men, not even those of the mighty city of Tritus, he spat out with a sneer, his eyes narrowing with hate. I had no choice but to swear my allegiance. Traitor. Anselm breathed. The queen, she has undeniable powers. Spectres from other worlds do her bidding, he said as if he were half in a dream, his eyes darting quickly around the room. Enough of this nonsense, Anselm said impatiently. Come willingly, King Roland. I will bind your hands, and we will march to the gates and end the conflict. No more of our men need to die out there. Anselm stepped forward with rope that had emerged from his warden robes, but the king recoiled from both of them as if Anselm had unveiled a venomous snake. No. You do not understand. Neither of you, he yelled like a lunatic as he staggered backward. I was told to maintain Grimhall or die trying. You cannot claim victory. The world belongs to Talgarth and the lioness. Caleb and Anselm closed in on him as he retreated, and he stumbled over his mantle, falling onto his back. King Roland, Caleb shouted, attempting to bring the old man back to reality, by order of the king of Tritus, you are under arrest for breaking the treaty of peace and conspiring with the nation of Talgarth. We have orders to take you back with us, dead or alive, and we prefer the latter. Get up and we will bind your hands. Let us be done with this. Suddenly, as he lay on the floor, he pulled a small dirk from his tangle of royal garments and jumped to his feet. His demeanor had now completely changed. King Roland II was gone. Caleb and Anselm took a defensive stance, ready for the pathetic man to pounce on them. Your Highness? Caleb yelled. His voice was filled with anger, more for his dashed hopes of peaceful resolution than for the king's actions. Drop your weapon and come with us now. Your men are dying, and any moment Tritus will claim the victory and be stampeding toward this very room. It is over. Stand down. I would rather suffer the wrath of any legion than abandon my orders here, he said with his dazed look again. His voice trembled. I cannot face the queen in failure. The spectres. He's mad, exclaimed Anselm. Without warning, King Roland broke out of his trance and rushed Caleb, swinging his dagger in a whirlwind of hysteria. The king caught him by surprise, but Caleb skillfully avoided his attacks, determined still to reason with him. Anselm had retreated a safe distance away, and started forming a hex with his hands that would seal the old man's doom if need be. No hexes. Caleb ordered as he deftly moved backwards to dodge the king's wild jabs, seeking an opening to seize his attacker's wrists. Stop this madness, he yelled, but the king seemed not to hear. Caleb felt a sudden urge to run his sword right through him. Clearly, the king was a lunatic and would not comply with their terms. With a crazed scream, King Roland threw an unusually quick jab, and the blade of his dirk sank into Caleb's flesh in the small, unarmored section between his chest plate and his shoulder. He cried out in pain and staggered back to place a better distance between them. Anselm moved in behind the old king, his hands poised in the proper position to cast a powerful warden hex. He obeyed his orders and waited for the command. Glancing quickly at his wound and confirming it was nothing too serious, Caleb's face turned grim and he held his sword out before him. The time for formalities had ended. Where is the man I knew? Where is Roland, the brave king who showed such kindness to me? Friend of my father. You have chosen the path of a traitor. Let it be known before fate that Tritus gave you the chance to mend your mistakes, but you refused. If you lash out, King of Grimhall, die by cold steel. Behind those words, Caleb prayed with all his being that the king would cease his attacks. He could not kill a friend of King Hallis, a man he used to respect. He would not. Fate has no interest in mankind, Roland slurred. He abandoned his world long ago to stand idly by as we burn each other. It is his way. Roland's hands dropped to his sides, the dirk hanging loose in his fingers. Caleb followed his lead and lowered his sword, but in an instant the king dashed forward, the dagger leading the way, aiming straight for Caleb's gut. It was all too easy. Caleb turned to the side at the last moment, clear of the king's attack, and he thrust out with his own sword, passing it straight through the old man's heart and through his back. The old man gave a cry cut short by the ebbing of his life, and madly clutched the blade of the sword, the edge slicing through his fingers to the bone. Caleb stared in wide disbelief at his attacker, whose eyes brimmed with tears. He had dispatched many foes in his 11 years as a soldier, but never one like this, an ally of his beloved king. A man whose life determined the peace of two nations. As he looked into Roland's fading eyes, he recognized him as the king he once knew, his memories flooding back at once. King Roland was strong then, a noble superior that as a fresh soldier he had admired. And now, as a mere captain, he had impaled that man like a hog on a skewer. His flash of thought broke away as King Roland's body went limp, and his weight pulled Caleb's sword down to the floor. The dead body slid off of the blade, and fell to the ground with the blunt sound of the inanimate. Anselm's hands lowered from their hex formation, and a shocked and perplexed expression spread across his face. They both stood over the corpse in solemn silence, sad and bewildered, watching the blood slowly seep out from under the body. Caleb's men entered the room cautiously with weapons drawn, but they stopped at the sight of the fallen ruler. "Go," Caleb finally said. "Find Commander Arvis and tell him what has happened here." His voice was soft and trembling. The men bolted away. Caleb looked down accusingly at his sword, as if it had made the kill of its own volition. "Caleb," Anselm ventured, stepping forward and rubbing the scars in his palms. "You tried everything. There was no more you could have done here." Caleb tapped his forehead twice and cupped his hand to his mouth in customary reverence, praying the soul of the departed to be left in the hands of fate. "I have failed," Caleb muttered. "I failed a nation and slain a king. When Grimmel's defenders learn that their king is dead, there will be anarchy, chaos." "You've done your duty," Anselm said after a pause. Caleb turned from the body and paced back and forth. Far beyond the walls they heard the blasting of horns, the horns of victory. The sound felt hollow as it echoed in the dark, empty chamber. Caleb turned at the sound and hurled his sword across the room with a shout. It bounced with a ringing echo and slid to a stop on the cold floor.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Episodes go live every Monday and Friday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The audiobook can be purchased in its entirety on Google Play Books. Get the whole trilogy now in both paperback and ebook formats. All links are in the description.